thanks to you guys for coming virtually, and thanks to you guys for being here in person. So I want to talk. I have two different talks today that we're gonna start with sort of the darker of the two talks. So we'll start with the black background, which is poisonous people, and then we'll move on to what I call the genius myth. And these talks are basically about the human element of software engineering. And for those of you who are dialing in, hopefully there's a few people dialed in who generally think that soft skills are just a complete line of bullshit and a waste of time. And I'm here to lead in to tell you that I'm not here to change your opinion on that, or have you suddenly just do this big kumbaya group hug type of stuff. Really, it's about, the point is that you can just spend a modicum of effort on people skills, just a tiny little bit of your time on understanding how to work with humans, and get a huge return on that and spend a lot more time writing code and shipping product. And that's really what this is all about. My colleague Ben and I have written these talks and have written our book together, have found in our experience that this is just definitely the way to be more effective and efficient. And for us, it's something we like, but for a lot of people, it's more about getting more product done. So, with that case, onwards to poisonous people. This is a talk we've given quite a number of times, and we've sort of grown it over time. And I'll lead in by reminding you guys that I'm from the Google Chicago office, and I started that office with my colleague Ben back in 2005. And this comes from our experience, not just at Google, but at a lot of different companies, including Apple and some other startups we've worked at. But this talk in particular is based on our opinions, and there's a lot of different ways you can run a community or run a team. We feel like this is one of the most more effective things you can do, but this is also based on our friend Carl's book, which are based on our experiences with these things, including open source as well as private companies. So the book that Ben and I have written, which just came out recently, is called Team Geek. And this is the poisonous people talk is chapter 4. Genius myth, I think, is chapter 1. So we're going to cover different things and the book covers a whole range of other people things. But when it comes to poisonous people, this is a good book, and I say steal this book, but it's because it's free on the web. And this is a really brilliant bit on the nuts and bolts of running projects in the open source world, that, interestingly enough, applies greatly to how way Google runs products internally, because just of the way engineering is designed, we have one giant code base. Everybody can sort of noodle around and kibitz, and sometimes it's really good, and sometimes that's really annoying. So the first question I have is, what is the most difficult part of writing software? And it's not choosing the language, it's not choosing the framework, it's not choosing the platform. It really is the people who work on the software. One of our former senior vice presidents at Google, Bill Corin, had a fairly famous quote that says, "Engineering is easy and people are hard." So I completely agree with that. So let's say that you've got what we call a poisonous person, someone who's causing problems on your team or your project. What do you do? So we've identified 4 separate stages that you sort of go through. You need to comprehend what the problem is exactly, because there's a lot of times where you'll find yourself attributing motivation or making a mistake about what's actually going on. How to fortify your team to be stronger when additional poisonous people show up in the future, and they will. Identify exactly what the problem is, and then lastly, just get rid of it. How do we sort of expunge it from your team? So let's start off with comprehension. Okay, what is the threat? What is the challenge that we're trying to fight against here? It's basically that no matter how big your team is, no matter how successful you are, you need to keep focus and attention on doing what you're here to do, which is typically shipping product. So you have to protect these resources, and it does take effort to do that. If you find that you and your team are expending effort in having interpersonal battles, yelling and screaming matches, loud disagreements, people storming out of rooms, that is energy that's wasted. It's basically heat that you could be being more efficient in focusing that energy into writing code. So what do poisonous people do? They distract your team, they emotionally drain your team, and they generally cause needless infighting. And in some cases, they could paralyze your team and derail forward progress. If, let's say, they're obsessive compulsive or perfectionist or someone obsessed with the perfect as opposed to the good. And people can do this unintentionally, even very nice people. I've worked with people who were incredibly smart, but will keep designing and designing and designing and designing something even when it's well past working. And so you sort of have to really understand when you can sort of spot this going on, and then we'll talk a little bit later how to deal with that. So that's generally our issue. We have attention, we have focus, and we have people who are trying to derail that one way or another. Paralysis is one example. So how can we fortify against this? The first thing is, and I say community here, but I really mean, that involves everyone around your team, not just engineering, but product and marketing and sales in many cases. So there's basically, we would say, if you humility, trust, respect, and politeness are ways to not only avoid spending a lot of time fighting or yelling or screaming or disagreeing. And I'm not saying that criticism is bad, because criticism is good. It's just really hard to give good criticism. But more than anything, it's a way of creating a team that is going to be more open to more people. You create a team that is going to be more comfortable for more people. If you create a team that's a bunch of chest-thumping people screaming at each other, you're going to alienate a lot of developers and a lot of people, period. So let's hit on a few things. I hate the term best practices, but really this is kind of what this is. And the first one I'm going to say is one of these things that makes most people cringe, and it kind of made me cringe a little bit until I saw how valuable it was. And it's have a mission statement. And this is super important for any small startup or company. But pick a direction, limit your scope, and go there. And taking the time to write a short mission statement that actually means something. Now, I'm not talking about the big, giant corporate mission statements that are, we help people help themselves, or we focus on focusing, or whatever, crazy stuff like that. I'm talking about a mission statement that is very clear, is very straightforward, and very simple, simply describes what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And making sure that coming up with this, if you've already got a team, can not only help focus you, but help you to understand which people in your team really are in agreement. If people aren't in agreement about where you're going, they're going to pull in different directions, and it's going to be a big problem and a waste of energy. Most people I know who are writing software have a mailing list, or 2, or 6, or 27. A mailing list and an archive is really important, because you want a record of these discussions that happen with your team, so that you can point newcomers back to them, so people can go sift through them or search through them and find discussions that have happened. When there's a message in a thread, one of the techniques I've seen poisonous people use intentionally or otherwise is what I call email filibustering. So when there's a heated discussion going on, and one person will go ahead and serial respond to every single mail in a thread. So you'll see 10 or 12 responses, and then you suddenly see 10 or 12 responses from one person, right? So, this is where you want to encourage people to summarize and respond in one email. Another thing that poisonous people do on a mailing list is what I call the noisy minority, where there's someone who disagrees with the consensus, and so they're just going to respond and yell and scream and stomp their feet in a mailing list, and it looks at first glance like, hey, there's a lot of dissent here, and people aren't agreeing about where we're going, what we're doing, or what we're discussing. And what it turns out is, if you look carefully, it's just one person making a whole bunch of noise. Do you think we should take questions as we go? I see a question popped up here, or do we want to take questions at the end? Rick, you have any thoughts on that, Rick? Rick's asleep. Because there's a question about mission statement. What makes a good mission statement for an engineering team, or is it more broad or narrow than that? I think that what makes a good mission statement personally is, again, I said a direction and a scope limiter. It's always great that someone will say, well, Google, says organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. I think it's good to be ambitious. I think it's good to be to tackle big problems, but oftentimes, especially when you're starting out, you want to have a limiter. So, for example, sometimes Google Web Toolkit was an open source project that I advised and tried and helped them create a mission statement. And they were basically creating a tool to help developers. Their mission statement was something like help developers write world-class web applications And they said using Java, and they specifically mentioned Java because, and they explained it below in their page. If you search the web for making GWT better, you can not only find this statement, but you can find all the discussion behind it. And they said we chose Java because of the existing tools, blah, 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 blah. And people would show up and say, hey, you know, we should do this for Python a JavaScript compiler, and Scala a JavaScript compiler, and all this other insane stuff. But this was a way of avoiding all this discussion. Say, look, this is what we're doing. If you're on board and agree with it, that's great. If not, then you can go noodle on something else. But describing what you do and is important. Describing what you don't want to do, I think, is also important. Otherwise, you wind up having the same discussions over and over again. And that sort of segues into the next slide, which is really simple. You should document all sorts of things. Not just your design docs, design decisions. You usually have a bug tracker, you document those sorts of things. But documenting mistakes, having postmortems when you screw something up are really important, because these are things you can go back and look on and see, look, this is what we did in the past. And if you're making that same mistake over again, it's a problem. But if you don't document it, institutional memory is, even for small teams, is only so big. And 2 years later, you'll find yourself making the same mistake. But I've got a little bit of a silly slide here. But the interesting thing is, and this is really interesting, I've found, is that if someone asks a question of you in person or in a mailing list, and you give them an answer, they may debate you for hours. If you point them to a web page, whether it's on your intranet or anywhere, it's like canon. Suddenly they're like, oh, well, people have thought about this. They've written it. I don't care if it's a wiki. I don't care if you said, oh, it's on a web page, and you ran off and you created the web page and typed it in. People will not argue fine points of this. I'm not saying that it's good to not have argument and debate, but it's good for people to, it's a way of showing, hey, we've thought about this, we've taken the time to put it down, and there we go. So we're talking about engineering here. I think it just merits a moment of talk about actual code and collaboration. It's worth pointing out that no one is ever taught how to work with other people in university, especially not in software engineering. Someone will always say, well, we had a group project. And I would argue that your group project taught you to trust no one more than anything else. Because usually people said, how was your group project? And they'll usually say, well, we had 4 of us and I did all the work because the other 3 people were jerks, or they just didn't show up. So for code collaboration, change lists, commit emails, code reviews, these are all really important things. Discourage people from doing what I call a power plant code change, where they're going to write 5, 6, 7,000 lines. That should start with a design doc and some sort of discussion, because if you try and review 5,000 or 6,000 lines, you're just going to be looking at it for style. You can't really review that for substance unless you want to pick the whole thing apart. And then the person who wrote the code is going to be all annoyed when you say, well, rewrite big, huge swaths of this, or I disagree with the direction you've gone in. I want to talk briefly about bus factor. The bus factor is the number of people in your team that have to get hit by a bus for you to wind up in a world of shit. And that's typically really high on very small teams, and it's really high on picky bits that have been written by one person. So it's worthwhile to put a lot of effort into documenting your project, into getting more than one person up on a particular bit of the code base. Because if you find that you've got one person who knows something, and I'm not talking about actually getting hit by a bus, although that does happen in some cities. People can leave your company. People can move on to a different area. They can have a kid. They can do any one of a number of different things that will cause them to not contribute the level that they've contributed at in the past. So it's definitely worthwhile to make sure you have more than one person, or a higher bus factor, familiar with any part of your code base. The last thing I'm going to mention is something that will typically cause no end of debate, is that I don't believe you should allow names in files in source code. At the top of, usually someone starts writing a new Java class or something, the top of it, author, Brian Fitzpatrick, fitz@google.com. And Google does this internally. I think it's a complete waste of time. And the reason I think it's a complete waste of time is because, first of all, your source control system damn well better track who's modified what lines. You should be able to look at an annotated view of any file. The second thing is that it's a waste of time. The question is, if you write a file, let's say a class, you write 30 lines of code, your name goes at the top. I show up and I write 20 lines of code. Well, I could put my name in there because I wrote 20 lines of code. If you show up and you do a bug fix, 2 lines of code, does your name go in there? What if you deleted a method that I wrote? Does your name go in there? And so it's just a ton of effort and a ton of inefficiency. Use your source control system. Have other ways for people to get credit for things as opposed to leaving little turds of your name all over the file. Believe it or not, I'm not a fan of bureaucracy, but I am a fan of having some simple, useful processes. And it's always good to question if those are useful or not. But and a lot of this is simple. Releasing software, we're gonna backport bug fixes that are important, security fixes. You test and release your software. You accept and review patches, maybe from other people in the team or other parts of the company. You should have a process for bringing someone on your team. At Google, for example, when someone joins Google and you start writing code, you always need someone to review your code before you put it in. But before you've gotten what we call readability in that code, before you've proven that you're familiar with our coding styles and practices, you have to get an additional review, which is a readability review for style. And that's something that you have to work towards getting, and usually in your first month or two at Google, writing a couple hundred lines of code, and someone gives this really picky review saying, oh, you missed a space here, you didn't tab this in, you named this variable weirdly, etc. Having something like that is really valuable because people should realize that there's a cost to being a member of your culture, and that shouldn't be some sort of like painful hazing or something like that. But it should be something that shows, look, we have a pride of quality of code, and here. Remember that the culture of your team is going to be created by the first few people on it. So little arbitrary decisions you might make are going to have massive repercussions down the line. And your culture will become self-selected. So, I've seen a couple of companies on a number of open source projects where one of the founding members winds up getting booted out later on because they drift off and do other things in the company, and then they come back and want to write code, and the 2-person engineering team where they would just like make changes to the live site is now a 25-person engineering team with a release process and a staging server and all, and it can cause problems. But if you build a strong culture, you should have the ability to push back on those sorts of things. But remember, more than anything, I'd say is that access to pushing code into your source control system should never be something that someone's just given along with their employee badge on day number 1. People love to vote on things. And I've been involved with the Apache Software Foundation for quite some time. And people talk about +1 or -1, and now with Google Plus, there's +1 everywhere. But people will love to say, oh yeah, no, we're going to argue about this for 10 minutes and I want to vote on it. Let's just call for a vote. Okay, the second you call for a vote, you're losing. Because voting is going to create a bunch of winners and a number of losers, and then some people in the middle who just don't care. Your goal should be to drive towards consensus. And that doesn't mean that everyone sits around and talks about it forever. If you've got a strong team, a strong leader, in many cases your leader will be the person pushing towards that, moving that forward more quickly than more slowly. I was involved with Subversion years ago for a very long time. I was one of the authors of Subversion. I helped write the Subversion book. If you use Subversion or have used Subversion, I would like to take this opportunity to apologize. I don't use Subversion anymore, and I think it's important to be able to learn when your projects should be, put to sleep or something. But we never had a vote while I was there. We had one vote. And we'd been around for 4 years, and it was space after paren and conditional clauses. That was the vote. We had a vote about that stupid thing. And people were like calling up people who hadn't like committed code in like months and said, hey, we have this vote, I want you to come in and vote, and then they're voting against them, and it was kind of crazy. But voting is just not the way to go for these kinds of things. Standards are important. I'm not going to read this quote to you, but a lot of people will hire someone for their team who is an obvious bad culture fit, or an obviously bad at working with people because they're super smart, they're a big name, or they've done something incredible. This is never worth it. It really is, and it's a hard thing when you're a small company, you're trying to ramp up and you're trying to hire people. But it's the kind of thing that will tear a team apart, especially if you're early on and don't have a really strong culture that can either adapt that person or reject them. You don't want to sacrifice your team's culture. So how do we know what a poisonous person is? And there's a lot of different kinds. So I'm going to take a minute to cover a few things that might tell you that someone could be a royal pain in your ass. First, they might have some very simple issues with dealing with you. They might be really into using things like, I don't know, all caps. They might really be into stuff like punctuation, or they might sound like they're from MySpace, right? These are kinds of things. These kind of add up after time. Just because someone uses one of them, whether it's ironic or not, doesn't mean that they're out to kill you. Someone might be clueless. Maybe they can't just pick up on the mood or the vibe. You're like 2 days away from code freeze, and they're like, hey, I want to do this great new feature. And people freak out. They might not understand the common goals, or they might, instead of reading documentation, they might just be tapping you on the shoulder and asking you questions every 2 minutes. Sometimes people are openly hostile, where they're going to insult the status quo. They're going to angrily demand that you help them. They'll try and blackmail you. If you don't put this feature in, this product's going to fail if you don't get this in here. Sometimes they'll just try and deliberately rile up the team just because they're bored, or it's fun, or it gets them attention. Conspiracy accusations are always fun, like there's a cabal. Of course, we all know that there is no cabal. Sometimes refusing to acknowledge the opinions of other people is an interesting poisonous trait. People will make sweeping claims, again, about the future success of the project. They'll reopen topics that have been settled for a long time without looking through your mail archives or your documentation or your postmortems or that sort of thing. Sometimes people are willing to complain but not help fix anything. In the engineering world, open source patches welcome is the open source way of saying go screw yourself. But because if you can complain about it, then you should be able to fix it to some extent. Sometimes people don't want to discuss design; they just want to dive right into coding. And this is a really tricky thing. Sometimes people are too insecure to take criticism, and this is a really hard thing I don't say just criticism, because sometimes criticism can be very destructive. Constructive criticism is very valuable, and it's very hard to give well. Sometimes companies are actually poisonous. Maybe it's the executives of the companies, maybe it's a competitor, maybe it's a lot of different things, but it's not just people. There are also poisonous cultures as well. So we have a vague idea of what poisonous people look like. So what do we do about it? How can we get them out of our projects? The first thing to do really is to take some time and step back and figure out what harm have they caused, or what harm are they causing? Are they draining attention and focus? If so, are they likely to benefit? It's a cost-benefit analysis here. Are they paralyzing the project? Is this discussion or dispute likely to end soon? Can I push it to resolution or consensus? So there's a couple things that you might do. I would recommend not feeding someone who's just deliberately trolling. If you give someone who's being a jerk sort of purchase or something to grab onto, they will engage you. I live in Chicago. I occasionally drive, and they will occasionally do something like cut somebody off or do something that maybe accidentally was rude. And usually they'll flip you the bird and start screaming at you. And one of my favorite things to do is turn around and look at them and wave at them and smile like they're a long lost relative. And that just usually sends them completely over the edge. But they don't. It's sort of bouncing back at them. But what they want is they want you to yell back at them so that they can just tell you off and get that last word in. Don't get emotional. And this is really hard. This requires a lot of work around self-awareness and sort of self-control. When someone insults something that's really near and dear to your heart, or they're just basically attacking you, you can take it personally. And if you can take and set this emotion aside and focus on the actual issue that they're having, you can actually sometimes get really valuable information out of that. It might be a bug report or something that they find wrong in your project. So there's a lot of things that are helpful to do. Pay a lot of attention to a new person in your team, even if they're bugging you or asking too many questions or something. Take the time to indoctrinate them and get them on board and get them used to your culture. Look for the fact under any emotion people have, but know that if you can get the real data out, that you're gonna be helping yourself and your team. Also, lastly, and this is like the last sort of thing, know when you need to look at pushing somebody out of your team. And an example of this was, we had, it's harder in open source. I always say writing open source software is like building cart houses on a trampoline in a crowded bar. It's just kind of crazy because so much is going on. There's a lot of distractions. And anyone who can show up and be like, hey, let me help you out. And in Subversion, we had this guy who kept showing up and trying to help. He really, really was trying to help. And he would start answering questions in the mailing list, and they were usually wrong. And he would always post like just random stream of consciousness ideas. And it was just sucking an incredible amount of energy out of the project. We actually wrote a script that went through our mail archives and showed that this guy was one of the most prolific posters, and that some of our coders were spending half their time posting, responding to him. And we actually talked to him and asked him to leave. So we used our stats to say, look, you just can't, you're not helping, you're causing a problem here, so back off. And again, the sort of repelling people with niceness is a very helpful thing to do, because it confuses them and they don't get what they want. The old Usenet adage is, don't feed the energy creature, and that's very valuable. But finally and this is really more important, because this can sound, this may sound at first hearing very elitist or very cruel, but more than anything is you want to address poisonous behaviors. You don't want to address the person. You don't want to embarrass someone. You don't want to personally attack them. You want to banish the behavior more than anything, if at all possible. And I've worked with people who have, and as an engineering manager now, I've had people that work for me that are just incredibly contrarian, and that are angering a lot of other people in the team. And it's easy to get mad at them or try and fire them or something like that. But if you take the time to talk to them and to get them to understand, look, this behavior you're doing, you may not realize it, is causing this result. They may not have realized it and say, oh, wow, well, I had no idea, and then change that. They may not be able to even understand what you're talking about if they're really not a people person. But you can probably have enough of a discussion with them to give them some tells that reactions other people will have to their actions. So you could say, look, when people are starting to do this and you're saying stuff, that means that they're getting angry. And so even if they can't read the anger, they can sort of pick up a few tells to understand that. So focus on the behavior when it comes to banishing something. So here's the obligatory, let's wrap all this up nice and clean in a package. There's 4 simple steps here. You have to keep focus. You really want to build a strong team. Identify when someone's being poisonous, and basically don't get emotional about it. Okay? But really the interesting sort of secret about the whole thing, not a secret I guess, but is that this isn't just about engineering teams. It really applies to any group you're in. This could apply to your family. This could apply to your bowling team, your church group, you name it. And so that's poisonous people. And thanks for coming. So the Q&A has disappeared, Rick. If you could bring that back up, we'll see if anyone has any questions before we move on to the genius myth part. Do you guys have any questions or comments? No? No, you're still here, that's a good sign. Someone says thanks, that's good. Okay, so we've got the mission statement question. Any other questions? I'm watching a blinking cursor, it's fascinating. It's always the fun part about speaking virtually, is that you never know exactly what everyone else is doing, if they're even there. All right, well, let's move on to the sort of brighter, happier side of the world, which I think it's almost a little bit more fun. For me at least, is the myth of the genius programmer. And again, this is a chance to reiterate that these are my opinions. I'm a version control geek from way back, and if you disagree, then you can get your own talk, right? But this isn't really objective, like double-blind studies or anything. This is based on a lot of my experience, just as the poisonous people stuff is. So I'll lead in with a few quotes, and I'm not going to read them, but I'll give you a chance to take a peek at these. So these were all when we first launched Google Code back in the day in 2006. This was some of the responses that we were getting from people. And there's sort of a theme to this. And it really, what it comes down to is, it comes down to insecurity. And it comes down to fear of a lot of different things. And there's a number of different reasons that people do this. But we call a lot of these reasons, we compile them up and call them with the genius myth. And here's one last quote, and then I'll not force you to keep reading big quotes on the screen here. But people want to be seen as smart and clever. I know that I do. I want you guys to think that I'm up here talking, that I have a general idea of what I'm talking about. But let's back off for a second. Let's talk about celebrities and product endorsements. Why does Wheaties pay celebrities and athletes from the Olympics all this money to be in their boxes? Why do people see Michelle Obama at the inauguration and then go buy every single copy of that dress out of every store, right? Michael Jordan, if you're a sports fan, which I am not, apparently he was a big basketball player, but people bought shoes. They went crazy. They paid hundreds of dollars for Air Jordan shoes. Is it because that they're going to suddenly play basketball like Michael Jordan? I think human nature really is to idolize celebrities, to try and imitate them, okay? So, hey, if I eat Wheaties for breakfast every morning, I'm going to be like an Olympic athlete. I can swim faster. I can lift more weights. I can run better. And people wouldn't consciously say that, but I think it's sort of a deep subconscious thing that we're operating on. This is also true in the world of programming. We have our heroes. People look to people like Linus Torvalds and Guido van Rossum from Python, Bill Gates, Kernighan, Pike, all these guys. A lot of them are super smart. They've done some great stuff, but I guarantee you, a huge percentage of the credit they get is not credit for what they've done. It's credit for what the teams that they've built, or the people who have worked with them, or people that have built on the work that they've done. So I'm here to tell you, once and for all, that there really is no genius. Geniuses are, in fact, incredibly rare. Even at a company like Google that prides itself on hiring crazy smart people. And the first thing I realized when I came here at Google is that, holy cow, A, why did they hire me? Clearly I'm an imposter. So, the second thing is, I've never seen so many smart people in the world. But even at Google, there is a lot fewer people that are geniuses than most people would let on. But the ultimate geek fantasy is for you to go off in your cave at home and work on some amazing piece of code and then come out and shock the world with your brilliant new invention. I think everyone really secretly wishes to be seen as a genius or do something really incredible by their peers. And the real basis for this, I would argue, is the other side of this coin, which is insecurity. It's a fear of showing mistakes. It's fear of being vulnerable. It's that desperate need for recognition or being clever. That's why engineers tend to really like puns. I love puns. I sit around with my friends and do puns and back and forth because we can show how clever we are. Doing that on stage, by the way, is just a terrible idea because you don't want to show the audience how clever you are. But as a result, people will go off, they'll hole up in a cave, and they'll try and burp out something beautiful and incredible and flawless. And rarely does invention happen. Invention is messy. Creation is messy. People coming up with great stuff, it's rarely one person. I can't name, and we'll see, I'll keep an eye on the questions here, but I can't name any one person who has written a piece of software by themselves, from soup to nuts, that's used by hundreds of millions of people. And nowadays, software on the internet is used by hundreds of millions of people. A classic example of this genius myth is asking for directions. How many of you guys will drive around for 20 extra minutes before taking the time to ask for directions? Well, fortunately, you don't have to do that anymore because we have maps on our phone, unless, of course, you have some companies' maps don't always work. So big deal. So why is this a problem? What's the inefficiency? Again, I'm here to talk about being more effective and less inefficient, or more efficient. The fact of the matter is this actually causes you to slow down how fast you're moving. It affects your velocity. In the case of a project, the old saying, many eyes make all bugs shallow, applies. Your code quality can actually remain low because of this. If you drop a giant power plant of 5,000 lines on people, you can't properly review that sort of thing. And I talked earlier about the bust factor, right? This is a way of keeping the bust factor super low, because in some cases people don't even know you're working on something. Or you could be working on something and you could be working on the same exact thing. But if you're not out there, if you're not getting a fast turnaround, there's a risk of working on the wrong thing, okay? Or just having to start over entirely. Okay, I mean, if you're writing code in a compiled language, do you write 10,000 lines of code and then hit compile? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. You write code and you compile. You write code and you compile. You have a very, very fast, tight feedback loop, and you want that with your code. You actually want that with your team as well. You're not going to learn as quickly if you climb into a cave. It's harder to improve your skills. It's harder to see your own mistakes. And this problem isn't unique to computer science. This pervades all scientists, math, anthropology, you name it. There's always that fear of being seen as foolish, and that desire to be seen as a genius. Even if you are a genius, working well with others will make or break you. You're just not a unique snowflake. Like people attract like people. Culture is going to build on itself. Software development is today inherently collaborative. And like I said, you're not going to find incredibly successful software that's written by one people. In many cases, it's not even a couple of people. I mean, look at things like Google search. I mean, there's a lot of people that work on that, and a lot of people who have worked on it. It continues to grow. So, how do we avoid this? The first couple of things is lose your individual ego. Now, because you don't want to be this guy. Lose the individual ego. It's great to have a strong collective ego. It's bad for you to be sort of the arrogant person on your team. Now, I'm not saying to be a doormat. I'm just saying to think that personal, arrogant type ego isn't helpful for your team. And I've said it again, and I'll say it one more time before, and I'll say it again, is that criticism is important and it's good. Give it politely, take it politely. Be constructive. Remember that you're not your code. Your code is a product of yours, and the goal is to make a better product, not to protect your feelings in this case. Constructive criticism is important. I had a friend of mine who left Apple and went and worked at a small company, and he was like a senior engineer there. And they weren't doing code reviews. And they told him they wanted to improve code quality. So he started doing code reviews. And after like 2 weeks, the director of engineering pulled him aside and said, man, all the guys said you're being really harsh, like all these criticism in their code and stuff, it's really bumming people out. And he's like, well, yeah, I mean, your code's crap, right? And so I think that there was a problem there with the culture, because people were very sensitive about their code, but he learned very quickly that he needed to sort of soften up his approach on this and work it in different manners. But in that case, lack of code reviews was really killing this team. Failing is important. I like to look at failing as a way of learning something very quickly. If anybody has a kid, which I do not, but I'm sure there's people who, you tell your kid, the stove's hot, don't touch the stove. Remember, this is going to be hot, you're going to hurt yourself. You can say that day and night, you can sit down and get into physics of it, but all the kid has to do is put their hand up on that stove, and they're going to learn immediately that, holy cow, that's hot, I don't want to touch that again. So failure is a way to learn something very quickly. Ben, my colleague, learned how to play banjo when we were first working together about 13 years ago, and he was really bad. But you're always really bad when you start. I was really bad when I started learning how to play guitar. I was really bad when I first started learning how to write code. But what he would do is, learning banjo, which sounds really fast, he would start playing things very slowly. He would make a lot of mistakes, he would learn from them, and he would continue to get better. There's a story that's been repeated hundreds of times on the web about the executive who makes a critical strategic mistake and loses $10 million for his company. And he goes in the next day, he packs up his desk, and of course the secretary says, hey, the CEO wants to see you in his office. So he trudges in the CEO's office and he slowly pushes the resignation letter across the desk, and the CEO looks at this and says, what is this? He said, well, it's my resignation. I assume that's why you called me in here. to fire me. He said, fire you? I just spent $10 million training you. Why would I fire you? Again, and that story's been attributed to millions and millions of people, but making a mistake and learning from it is valuable. You want to fail as early and you want to fail as cheaply as possible. Making the same mistake over and over again is insanity. So focus on building a culture that embraces failure. Failing fast again is important. Don't try and erase your tracks. This is one thing that people we saw at the beginning codes were trying to do, and people will use git rebase to do this. For example, like I can do a whole bunch of crazy messy stuff. I'm going to clean it up into one single change list and burp it out to everybody. Right? That's a default that can be a bit dangerous. So I would just say be careful. But like we said with the banjo, right? The more you practice, why is practice important? Because it makes that iteration failure cycle faster. Your baseline of productivity goes up quickly as you practice. And another thing to do here is to if you want to learn and make yourself better, is to be a small fish. And this is not just like one of those things where it's better to be the dumbest person in the room versus the smartest person in the room. But if you only work with people who are your junior, you're never going to have the opportunity to improve your skills. And if you're at an existing company and you are a team lead or something, this is a great opportunity to remind you to hire smarter people that are smarter than you. Because if you always hire people who aren't as smart as you that you can push around and bully around, you can't scale that. You're always going to be a single point of failure. You're always going to be, but you're never going to learn anything. So a lot of people confuse being seen as intelligent or witty or something with always just getting people to do something for them, to being the leader of consensus, to being the influencer. The fact of the matter is that being open to influence is just as important a part of this as being able to influence people. Because the more you're open to it, the more influence you have on other people, because you gain more credibility. If you are a lead and you get people, you can build consensus, get people to do your bidding, or you can influence other people. If you never listen to what they have to say, the really smart people who are looking to have influence in your product, they're just going to leave and go somewhere else where they can have that influence. And beyond that, it's a damage to your credibility because you're not always going to have the right answer. And so you have to listen for when that is. And here's a sort of secret executive trick that I've seen. Really smart executives, when someone asks them if they can do something, instead of saying to themselves, is this a good idea? Is this a brilliant business decision? They'll say, is this easily reversible? And if that answer is yes, then let's say, go right ahead. Take a couple days and try this out. Is this going to require 3 years or 3 months and 6 engineers? Well, that's costly. Is this launching a product without thinking it through? That might be not reversible or harder to reverse. So if it's easily reversible, say yes. Vulnerability is really interesting because people are often afraid of admitting they're wrong or apologizing. Repeated vulnerability is actually in the long term perceived as a strength, because people see you as someone who's comfortable, who's secure, and who respects and listens to the opinions of other people. If you're unable to be vulnerable, you will not have the ability to compromise or actually collaborate. So this is actually really important. I just see some questions popped up here, or 8 questions. So we'll save that to the end, I think, because it's not actually about what I'm talking about at the moment. So classic examples of people trying to use technology to solve sociological problems. DRM, this is a great example, right? DRM is getting more and more prevalent in the world, and nobody copies music or movies across the internet anymore, right? Yeah, of course not. That's just ridiculous. If you're a version control geek like myself, sometimes people will set up their version control system and they're going to limit the graphic guys to only committing in this area. They're going to limit the documentation guys to authentication restrictions to only committing in this area, and engineers can do anything because they're the engineers, and the marketing people can't even look at it. You know what? It's a version control system. It is basically a history-preserving device. If someone does something catastrophically stupid, you can roll back. So you really shouldn't worry about that. Another example of this is the spam arms race, right? People are trying to find different ways to get spam into your inbox. Other companies are finding ways to get out of it. These are sociological problems. Technology can't solve them. Keep that in mind when you're choosing tools or when you're trying to solve a problem. Is it something that requires a change to your culture or working with your team, or is it something you can actually just throw technology at? All right, so a lot of people say, hey, I'm working on this thing off of my own. When do I want to bring other people in on this? So I've got this sort of idea I've been brewing off in my spare time. So projects, you don't actually need to hide, period, at all. It's okay if people discover it on your own, whether it's at your company or anywhere. Just don't advertise it. Don't go off saying, hey, I'm writing the world's next greatest blah, blah, blah. And then you're going to invite people to be like, well, no, that's a terrible idea. So you have an idea. Typically, the next thing to do is to prototype it. And then is sort of the point where you want to start bringing people in. Hey, what do you think about this? Take a look. Get a minute to take a look at this prototype that I brewed up. Is this a good idea? Got any tips or suggestions for making it better? Am I doing anything really stupid? And then you can start cranking over code and take over the universe, right? But the real trick is that third milestone, right? When do you start collaborating? Okay, and this is where a lot of people, and myself included, make a mistake. If you wait too late, you have a problem. Okay, so if it's done, you're too late. Okay, it's a huge risk of wasting your own time. You might have bad design choices that are completely undoable. You might be reinventing wheels. You might have an unreviewable code bomb. Nobody's going to want to collaborate with you in a lot of cases because they have no chance to really influence. At that point, they're just sort of tweaking or fixing bugs. This comes out of a thing that Ze Frank had a long time ago, and something called brain crack, where you just have sort of ideas in your head and they just stay in your head and you don't ever share them because you don't want anybody to steal your ideas. And the longer they just stay there, the bigger and more amazing they get. And then eventually one day you sort of burp it out and try it, and you quit your job and go off, and it's just a terrible idea because you haven't bounced it off of anyone at all. If there's no running code to play with or prototype or anything, it's probably too soon. So there's a risk of wasting everybody's time. There's no clear direction at all. You don't have a strong feeling for what you're doing, so you can wind up swimming in design by committee. And this can be just a huge gumption sink, because instead of trying to discuss what you want to do or what you're attempting to do, you're trying to sort of derail conversations and get things in the direction you're going into. And you're going to waste a lot of time arguing, and it could be a sort of way of stifling your individual creativity. The sweet spot is, again, I'd say post-prototype. Have a coherent design, have a little bit of running code, but be ready to discuss changes and backtrack if necessary, and be ready to accept criticism and reverse ideas. It's a good way to a good point at which you should be ready to accept some coding help or some design advice. And lastly, don't hide your history. Right? If you made a bunch of mistakes from here to there, that's okay. Again, that vulnerability, that fallibility is okay. And there are places where fallibility is just not allowed in the universe, and that tends to be politics. People use that as a weapon against you. It's a different world in engineering, thankfully. At least I hope it is in where you're working. Quick case study. So Subversion started back in 2000 with 2 to 3 people working on the design doc. And then we pitched that out there, and we went going. We had a very specific goal, and there's a lot of people that make fun of Subversion, and again, I make fun of Subversion, so I'm one of those people. But at the time, it was really incredible. Everybody was still using CVS. There was nothing else out there that more than a few people were using. And the thing we realized is that as we were doing this, and we continued to go forward with Subversion and other parts of Subversion, is that if you get more than 5 people in the room writing a design doc, you can't get anywhere. And so we've tried this a number of different times, and so the sort of seed or core of a design doc tends to be written by 1 or 2 people with a few collaborators. To try and get 10 or 15 people together to write a design doc, it just doesn't work. Try this. Take 5 of your friends, so there's 6 of you. Go downtown to San Francisco and try and spend 3 hours to go and see the city. 3-hour walking tour of San Francisco, impromptu. Unless you elect someone to be your leader, you're going to stop at every street corner and discuss where you're going next. Okay? Under 5 people, it's pretty easy to come to consensus on that. And the interesting thing about this is that when we first started, Brian Bellendorf was our leader. He's one of the founders of the Apache Software Foundation, currently the CTO of the Economic World Forum. He was the CTO of the company that those guys were working at. I was a volunteer. And they started talking They got the design doc written and then started iterating on it in public. And people were throwing all this information at him. And they were like, oh, well, we're going to go hide in a corner and just go back to working on this, just the 5 of us. And he totally jumped on us for doing this. He's like, look, you guys have got your design doc. You need to collaborate at this point. Get more feedback at least, so we can get some running code. And we thought he was being ridiculous because he just didn't understand. Turns out years later that he was absolutely right in this case. My last case study, again, only 2 of them here, is myself and my collaborator, Ben, who I wrote the book Team Geek with, who I've written this talk with, who I've written half a dozen other talks with. The way that we write our talks is that we actually will meet in a cafe in Chicago with pen and paper and a whole lot of coffee and start throwing ideas out and just sort of scribbling things down and eventually work ourselves into an outline. And then after that outline's done, one of us will take the outline and start creating slides from that. And then we'll sit down together and refine the slides. All right, so that's sort of the point at which we're ready for feedback. Then we will grab a couple of our sort of trusted friends and sit down with them and have like a table talk with them. It's like a script reading or something almost. And get some pretty good harsh criticism and feedback from them. Again, constructive, but it can be really hard sometimes. And we'll revise our slides based on that. And then we'll give it to the engineers in our office. And, we've got about 80 engineers or so. We'll get about 20 to 30 people show up and ask them explicitly for criticism, constructive criticism. And then we'll usually get piles of emails with a lot of stuff. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you don't have to actually take everyone's advice. You can pick and choose it. If you get 10 different people telling you things, you'll start to see trends. And you'll start to see obvious weak points in your talk. And then we'll give it again to a user group, some local group of students who are unsuspecting that they're being used as guinea pigs in Chicago. Watch their reactions, and then we're usually ready to give it at a conference or in some more public forum. So that's sort of how we evolve our talks. And again, these are just 2 sort of simple examples that I wanted to use to talk about iterative development, when to bring people in to collaborate. And so, once again, I'll just sort of sum it all up, is that the harder you try to be a genius, the less you're going to look like one. Unless you really are a genius, and the odds are that you aren't. It's simple math. Collaborate early and often. And lastly, really timing, figuring out that sweet spot for going for collaboration is important. And again, just like the poisonous people talk, the interesting thing about all this is that if you do all these things and you're open to influence and you are vulnerable, is that people will actually think you're a lot smarter than you may be. So anyway, that is the genius myth on top of poisonous people. And thanks for listening. Anyone, if you're still dialed in, that's great. And we have a long question here. Let me see if I can read this out loud for the people in the room. The idea of addressing poisonous behaviors of a person rather than a poisonous person is interesting to me. It separates the person from their behaviors and feels like a generous way of dealing with a difficult person. Imagine the following situation. Person P has been behaving in a poisonous way, and members of the team are frustrated. Assuming person P agrees to address those behaviors, do you have tips for helping the team get past the damage that was previously done? Wow, that's really interesting. Well, first of all, thanks. I'm glad you find that interesting way of dealing with that. That addressing the behavior is interesting. It's something we learn the hard way, and we actually talk about failure. Most of the stuff that I've learned that's in this slide deck is from me screwing up. It really is. I'm a kind of person that learns by doing, and usually by doing it wrong. So we actually wound up basically pitching a few people out on their asses before we realized that we could even attempt to get rid of behaviors. The question of how do you get past the damage that was previously done, usually people are a lot more resilient than I realized. We had and this happened just very recently with both Ben and I, on a team that I managed and then a team that Ben started managing afterwards. There was a guy on the team who was super smart, really good engineer, and we were under a lot of pressure to meet a tight deadline. And he was freaking out because he came from a culture where people freaked out and just started yelling at people under pressure and under deadline. And it wasn't really collaborative, and that everyone should be like panicking. And so he was sort of freaking out, and he was causing a lot of friction. He was trying to just sort of take over everything and like be the tech lead for something, even though he wasn't necessarily the tech lead, even though he didn't have that bigger picture. And so he had all these sort of poisonous behaviors. And Ben talked to him a bit, and we eventually actually both sat down and had a long talk with him. It was a super difficult talk for us to have. It was very uncomfortable because this guy was clearly distressed. He was clearly upset. So it was important for us to listen to him, but to try and get him to understand that, you know, we weren't going to hold him responsible if this completely blew up. And that the goal here was for him to do his best and to work as part of the team, and that he should understand that what he's doing is alienating everyone else in the team. And you know, we went back and forth. There's a lot of different sort of parts of this intervention, but to make a long story only slightly longer, he started to make some changes. And then we kept talking with him and coaching him, and he continued making these changes. And a year later, he is one of the top contributors in the team, and he's gotten past all these poisonous behaviors. We did get past this crazy crunch time too. But the rest of the team just sort of didn't hold it against him. Like they sort of moved on. They saw his new behaviors. It wasn't like he went around saying, "Hey, I'm really sorry for being a dick." He just sort of started behaving in a different fashion. And people were like, "Hey, this guy's cool to work with." And no one really, it wasn't like we had to have some intervention to say, "Hey, everything's different now." So I guess the short version of that, the answer to that is, I think you might be surprised at how resilient people are when people do actually change. The hardest thing that you will ever try to do is to change someone else on your team, to get the team to acknowledge that that this poisonous person isn't poisonous anymore. The easiest thing that that person can do is just to start acting differently, and people will immediately react differently to you. I've seen it turn around overnight time and time again. So next question. Or statement. Let's see. Asperger's is pretty prevalent in engineering circles, low empathy, difficulty with reciprocity. Would you consider this poisonous, and can you describe ways to work with these types of folks? That is an excellent point, and it can be really hard. The one thing for I would say for ASPE people is, and I talked earlier about this briefly, is that trying to get them to see that this is happening first. And second of all, trying to get them to pay attention and look for the tells, right? If I don't understand that people are having these emotions, I can still probably learn that if you're standing here with your arms crossed and your face is getting red, that maybe this person is angry about something. So it could take a lot of work, but and I don't know that I have like a pat answer for this. Like, oh well, you know, you just do steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 and give them a pill and everything's fine. But I would say that getting them to understand the logical reasons behind attaching some relevance and importance to people's emotions is good. And that's one of the things that I've attempted a little bit to do in this talk, and I probably should do more in the abstracts in general, is that this isn't just about, hey, this is the whole kumbaya, like fun way to work with people, although it is. It's more about, hey, this is a way to be more effective. This is a way to ship more software, to write more code, to spend more time working on your product, right? Companies and teams are basically a mechanism. It's like, just think of a mechanism of gears, like a fine clock. And you run it for a while, it might be okay, but eventually if you don't put a little bit of lubrication in, most of these will just grind to a halt. And spending the time on the people parts of it, and again, this is what the whole book Team Geek is about. Spending a little bit of time on building the teams, on getting people to understand the human element and how to work with other people is what's going to keep the whole thing running. So, you guys have any other questions or comments? No? You're still awake? It's a good sign. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming, or VCing in, or whatever it is that you're doing over there. And I appreciate you guys having me.